Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb. One of the questions of great interest from the very beginning of the pandemic was whether or not a novel coronavirus was a creature of nature, zoonotically evolved, or whether the biological agent had been cultivated in gain-of-function research in a dual-use research of concerned lab. The other vexing question, at least tangentially related, has been whether or not Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease, the highest paid federal government official, had lied. So, cutting to the chase and getting straight to the point, let me just say that after over a year of research on these topics of interest, several rounds of Freedom of Information Act requests that resulted in what is now 6 litigations in various stages in both state and federal courts. The answer to both questions is yes. The invisible enemy that has altered the way of American life, closed businesses, churches, libraries, and schools, has infected over 45 million Americans, and it has been attributed to almost 740,000 American fatalities, primarily the elderly residing in nursing care facilities, a population cohort that continues to be the highest at risk for mortality, even after the aggressive distribution of vaccines, and a known population at risk from the very beginning, found its origins in the source that the reportedly nation's leading infectious disease control expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, has repeatedly assured the American people was the most unlikely source for what has been also described as a highly contagious and lethal disease, a claim that all evidence suggests is not truly the case, despite our perceptions. Psychologists say that grief goes through 5 stages, beginning with denial, moving to anger, moving to bargaining, proceeding to depression, and resolving itself in acceptance. So let's give a quick summary of exactly how we arrived at this conclusion that is now in our most recent litigation effort, a petition for extraordinary writ to the United States Supreme Court filed earlier this week. I ran for Congress in 2016, and one great topic of interest for my opponents was my military service, which became the topic of at least 2 stolen valor blogs and libelous claims that I was not the person who I pretended to be in my military service. At the time, long before a pandemic, it was certainly a bit of an annoyance, which my opponents jealously exploited to full advantage. But now that their battles are won, perhaps we can set the record straight about the information that they worked very, very hard to suppress and discredit. For almost 2 decades, I served in the U.S. Army and retired as a field grade officer, the branch of military intelligence. Having been accessed into the officer corps after service as an enlisted person in special operations in the 75th Ranger Regiment, to a unique position at the 902nd Military Intelligence Group, responsible for all Army strategic counterintelligence in the continental United States. With that base of experience in special operations and as gone above corps level counterintelligence, the clear majority of my military career might be summarized as involving the specialty areas of force projection, or deploying assets to fields of operations around the world, and force protection, or keeping our soldiers safe. Why one might wish to discredit that information before a pandemic that, on all evidence, suggests it involves a biological agent that had undergone years of development, even predating my run for Congress, raises a reasonable suspicion, particularly because while serving in strategic counterintelligence, I have played a key staff role in the formation of the precursor to the intelligence activity that was reported by ABC News to have alerted the former president as early as November 2019. And experience as a former biological warfare planner would provide a great advantage to a leader attempting to resolve the current public health crisis that continues even today. Just as getting such a person with such knowledge and experience out of the way would provide at least a great tactical advantage to a plan to engage in what would be essentially a biological war of terror. And the nation's only physician serving as state governor has repeatedly said that he is fighting a biological war. Just as my prior experience in that capacity in the military has qualified me to be certified as a subject matter expert in litigation, I possess sufficient training and experience as a FOIA analyst to be certified as a subject matter expert to present testimony to a court on those topics of concern of primary interest in our latest litigation, where we had presented one easy question, but a probing question that has many broader implications. For those involved in infectious disease control, like the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, there are two very important metrics of risk that epidemiologists generally work hard at the very beginning to determine, to make things easier later on, but which metrics, once the effort is commenced, are not very difficult to determine, raising a reasonable suspicion in itself. And those metrics, still to date unknown, are the secondary attack rate and the infectious dose, terms very familiar to those engaged in the profession of medicine and biological warfare, but terms that may or may not be familiar to a layman. So let me briefly explain. The secondary attack rate is the measure of transmissibility that even most recently Dr. Rochelle Walensky, the director of the CDC, has stated quantifiably and convincingly to some as a reproductive number of 8 or 9. However, because of its high reliance on valid assumptions and not being tied to any empirical raw source data, relying upon rather a metadata analysis, which is a deductive process of reasoning or top-down approach rather than the inductive or bottom-up approach in determining a secondary attack rate, has been expressly rejected by the CDC, raising a reasonable suspicion for this departure from routine infectious disease control protocols, and by a licensed and practicing physician who has presented herself to the public as such. And this is an issue raised in our current litigations that have not been reported, intriguingly, in the press. The other important metric is the infectious dose, which developers of vaccines, more than anyone, are fully aware is a necessary quantum of knowledge to develop an effective vaccine by its connection to what are technically described as correlates of protection. Those serological titers of immunity that the immune system would require to prevent an infection, which would, to a reasonable person, be a quantifiable metric of significant value, not only assessing whether a vaccine product might be effective and not just efficacious at producing an immune response, but also to determine whether a person has, by prior infection, attained any level of natural immunity. In the military, whether operating in offense or in the defensive posture, military leaders are greatly concerned about force-on-force ratios that will ensure success in battle, and do not just arbitrarily and capriciously rely upon a faith that they possess an extra level of protection. At least that was the ethos before the mandate for vaccines in the Department of Defense by the current secretary. Just as generally in composite risk assessment, military leaders before pandemic would never accept any unnecessary risk, will always perform a cost-benefit analysis, and would first, before presenting a problem solution grabbed from off the shelf, attempt to define in the most comprehensive terms a description of the threat so as to develop preventative measures that are reasonably calculated to mitigate or eliminate the risk. The business of intelligence. And the failures of the current leadership in DOD is also the focus of our present litigations against the compulsory vaccines policy. In late May, 2 months after we had submitted our FOIA request to the White House, the president had presented to the American people that he believed that the origins of a novel coronavirus was of such great importance that he had tasked the intelligence community to resolve the mystery of the origins within just 90 days, a very short suspense, but also subjected to a limited inquiry, restricted to determining whether the pathogen had, one, more likely or not been the product of a zoonotic evolution, or two, had found its origins in a laboratory. No wiggle room. While early in the course of this term-restricted inquiry, Secretary of State Antony Blinken had announced his doubts for the success of the hasty effort, taking a position of diplomatic significance that the origins of a novel coronavirus could only be determined if and only if we were granted full access to the virology laboratory, a highly restricted military complex in Wuhan, an offer that a sovereign nation would more likely than not immediately reject, closing the door on that option that may have sounded good in the press. Since these standard metrics are still unknown, despite the fact that they would be rather easily determined under normal circumstances, the treatment most resembled attempts by public officials and the press when discussing matters that were determined to be classified at the time. For instance, a nuclear-powered aircraft like the USS Theodore Roosevelt, which was stricken in March of 2020, officially can exceed speeds beyond 30 knots, making it the fastest warship in the world, an advantage gain of function when combined with its other unique capabilities for naval sea power. However, the top speed, the number, the metric, the quantifiable number, like infectious dose and the secondary attack rate for COVID-19 is still unknown, prompting our FOIA request to the White House on March 23rd of this year, which was immediately acknowledged as received by the White House. Under the FOIA, any government agency, even the White House, has only 20 days to issue a response, which can include a request for more time, or even a statement of reasons as to why certain information cannot be disclosed, including a special exemption for information that is considered to be classified. However, under Executive Order 12958, dated April 17, 1995, and signed by President Bill Clinton, the fact that something is classified is not classified information of itself. And our request only posed the question as to whether the infectious dose and or the secondary attack rate for COVID-19 was classified information. An easy yes or no answer. However, after failing to obtain a response by July 4th, we initiate our first litigation to compel the White House to provide a simple response. Test positive or test negative for classified information. Yes or no, up or down. And after failing to be able to secure summary judgment from the Federal District Court in Richmond, or even a hearing for this simple answer, on this week we were compelled to file a petition for extraordinary writ to the nation's highest court to obtain a simple yes or no answer. Why would the White House refuse to respond? Maybe the question of a novice. Unless you were familiar with national security, you may or may not know, but could easily research and determine that in addition to stating the fact that information is classified is not in itself classified information, you would discover that no information may be classified unless it is in the property of the United States government. And at least since 1980, the law has been crystal clear that the government could not have classified these aspects of COVID-19 if a novel coronavirus was a product of nature. And hence a novel coronavirus, contrary to the repeated denials by Dr. Anthony Fauci, Dr. Michelle Walensky, Dr. Ralph Northam, and others in the medical profession, could only have been the product of cultivation in a research laboratory facility. That concludes this briefing. This briefing is unclassified, as you were. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our schools. Honest. Carry on. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.
Thunk, I could have had a vaccine.